I got the jacket on again, huh? Okay, alright. So at some point, something happened over the weekend. And it's not just, I believe, connected to events on the other side of the globe. As a matter of fact, I already know that there has been in this hemisphere an effort to bring attention to accusations for crimes that have happened in the Central American area, specifically in Guatemala. As a matter of fact, I've known for several years about an effort to prosecute a trial connected to allegations of systematic rape, as well as other acts of genocide that occurred involving against indigenous women primarily in specific communities in Guatemala, including that were visited upon them by members of the military in Guatemala, allegedly trained by members of the military in the United States. And I know this. And one of the things I've known about this in the time frame that this has happened is my understanding that at some point in time, specific to appropriations that were done in connection with Kosovo, concerning war crimes proceedings, legal support for war crimes proceedings in Kosovo, and in consideration of matters happening over there, that there has been this incredibly high risk legal leveraging when it comes to accusations of war crimes, and especially involving accusations of genocide. We also know that under international legal standards, war crimes proceedings have a different kind of structure when it comes to their promulgation than a traditional criminal proceeding, including a criminal proceeding that might involve some sort of multinational coalition effort. It also is distinct from, for instance, the International Criminal Court, or something equivalent to, say, the European Court. And I know that part of what that involves is a use of narrative. And I'm concerned about this and have been for a while. Part of my concern is two-pronged. First of all, when you're trying to do something like a war crimes trial, including one that does not have a direct, shall we say, instantiation, and has not been called out in a specific direct forum in a time spatially confirmed context, that one of the things we have to deal with is immunity. The privileges and protections of immunity that are accorded to people in public office that would otherwise be in a command authority position or would be the actual intellectual authors of state policy. It also calls into consideration private sector facilitators, whether or not they are primary campaign sponsors of those intellectual authors, or whether or not they are invested enough in the economy to be able to avail themselves of the financial or other benefits that go into the impunity that is ongoing in the course of executing something that would qualify as a war crime or even an intentionally orchestrated act of genocide. Secondly, one of my concerns is that part of the punishment, part of the prosecution of accusations of war crimes involves a kind of restitution that is itself a very heinous crime. And I actually understand that this is what has been happening in the last 20 years. And somebody has been using accusations of war crimes in order to visit very significant reprisal on token representatives of the entity or the community identified as being the culprit. This is a very significant problem. It's part of how I understand that right now there is actually a legitimate cause. There's a legitimate and just cause for accusing entities of war crimes that themselves previously may have understood themselves to potentially be victims of some sort of significant crime, up to and including that which would qualify as a war crime. One of the means by which I'm concerned this has been happening is by specifically and selectively targeting people to medically disable them in order to acquire their genetic materials. That somebody has determined that there are specific individuals that are to be acknowledged, that are to be held accountable. But in the course of those people evading justice, and in the course of those people making themselves available of the benefits associated with the crimes they visited on their own people, including in acts of political repression, including in acts of consolidation of power, and including in hiding behind false understandings of what they can get away with under the law, part of which ends up accumulating based upon their consolidation of wealth and concentration of power within their own milieu, that they end up waving it off on other people. They find someone to volley about as their proxy, And at another level, there is very, very high stakes wagering that goes on. Being able to successfully get a war crimes accusation into the public realm takes a lot of political capital. And who actually has the political capital to get it acknowledged if they themselves have not accumulated that political capital under very questionable circumstances? This is a very significant problem, and I contend, unfortunately, that at least since the mid-1990s, there was ample evidence that there were specific individuals, including but not exclusively Americans, that were associated in a very specific kind of network, including and especially individuals that believed themselves to be specifically and uniquely possessed of some sort of legal acumen, that made it their calling to leverage accusations of war crimes for other political agendas. That they literally selectively identified specific contexts under which they would focus on attempting to support this kind of war crimes investigation or this kind of war crimes investigation, and they leveraged them at that level. And part of what they do is they involve themselves and contextualize it within a constant process of narrativization and re-narrativization, with the understanding that the exhumation of the pain and the grief, including in isolation like this, including through therapy notes, including through presumed testimony that may not actually make it to literal trial, but is compelled at the intercession of the social worker, the caseworker, the warden, the lawyer, over and over again, with proffering and an attempt to get them to change the narrative, to incorporate within the narrative a particular structure that over successive years, maybe even decades, ends up becoming a paradigmatic experience for operationalization in another manner. And so over time, the sitting on it, the refusal to actually prosecute it, is an effort to try to erase the actual social memory and to re-engineer the society itself, to not even have consciousness that crime was committed against them. And part of the way that is done is selectively targeting exemplars within the society to be subjected to the punishment in the stead of the intellectual author, while contrived sympathies are exacerbated in order to support the criminal culprit themselves. You're supposed to valorize the criminal. You're supposed to see yourself in their suffering. You're supposed to internalize their predicament as your own. And in order to overcome whatever would be the shame associated with having to deal with and confront your own potential culpability or complicity, including on a much smaller scale, then you have to advocate for them. You have to support them, including in manners that provide an alternative to having to look the pain in the face, to having to actually hear their voice, to actually see their broken body, to understand it in those manners, to actually have to hear the testimony, to feel it actually vibrate in your body. They would rather break your bones using some sort of sonic equipment so you can go to the doctor and get on drugs than make you have to go through the catharsis of seeing your own struggle in somebody else's. This is absolutely 100% an orchestrated theatrical performance in some ways. And I've watched it. I've watched how they've leveraged the situation in Guatemala to cover up for other crimes. I've watched how right now there are playing out of intentionally orchestrated contrivances, specifically, for instance, in what's going on in Nicaragua, having to do with actual war crimes that were not even addressed as war crimes during Iran-Contra. And this is what we're dealing with. And in the course of that, because there has not been an actual divestment of the illicitly acquired gain from alleging that one was victorious over a significant criminal, like the Japanese during World War II, like the Nazis during World War II. We looted them once we won, the United States and our allies. We took what we wanted. We bonded other countries to reconstruction. When it came time for those bonds to come due, what did we do? I contend that there was a comprehensive 20 to 30 year period where people wanted to get insurance coverage against their own culpability with war crimes. including war crimes committed in the course of taking that which was developed. The Nazi regime was highly technological. As a matter of fact, most of our major microprocessing capabilities globally were a result of systematologies that were developed for and tested out in the concentration camps of Nazi Germany. Now, when we learn about the history of computers, or we learn about our first experience with HTML code, do they tell us about this? When they talk to us about how they're going to put us in the database so that then it's going to be easier for us to get resources, do they tell us about this? Do they tell us about what relationship our social security number has to registration of individuals processed through some form of internment facility? No, they don't. That's the intent. The horror is presented for a while in order to raise consciousness enough to try to negate our relationship